The screams of men, women, and children mingled in an awful chorus with the shriek of the wind and the roar of the breakers. Passengers were swept away in bunches by massive waves that rose as high as the ship's mastheads. Imagine frail women wearing only night dresses, barefoot on the frozen ratlines, trying to shield children in their arms from the icy wind and rain. These are the final echoes from the SS Valencia, a maritime massacre that forced Pachena Point into existence. For 117 years, this wooden tower stood tall in the graveyard of the Pacific, guarding a coastline littered with shipwrecks and the souls of sailors once dragged head down through the churning surf. But on October 24th, 2024, the final watch came to an end. The light vanished. Now that the keepers have departed, do the spirits of the abyss truly fall silent? Or are they waiting for someone to tell the rest of their unfinished story? Don't walk away just yet. Stay with me until the very end of this journey. If you share my passion for the legends of the sea, I can promise you, this is a tale of a lighthouse so unique and gripping, you won't find it anywhere else. Let us begin our journey to find the answer right now. Pachena Point is not merely a coordinate on a map or a static feature of the British Columbia coastline. It is a lethal bottleneck, a jagged tooth of stone at the edge of Vancouver Island that has functioned for centuries as the predatory heart of the graveyard of the Pacific. Positioned at the treacherous, wind-whipped entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, this is a location where geography itself is a hunter. Here, the vertical cliffs do not merely meet the ocean. They erupt from it, rising 100 feet straight out of a churning whitewater abyss. There is no soft sand here, no gentle beach for a desperate landing, and absolutely no mercy for the shipwrecked. Beneath the deceptively rhythmic swell of the surface lies a subterranean labyrinth of hidden reefs, jagged and sharp, waiting like ancient teeth to tear through iron hulls and wooden ribs alike. When the blinding, suffocating fog rolls in, as it does with a spectral regularity, and the coastal currents turn vicious, Pachena Point transforms into a blind trap. It is a place where the height of human technology is routinely pulverized by the raw, primordial anger of an ocean that refuses to be tamed. This inherent violence is etched into the very nomenclature of the land. The name we recognize today, Pachena, is an anglicized echo of a term from the indigenous Pacheetit tribe, and it carries a meaning as haunting as the shipwrecks it overlooks. Foam on the rocks. To understand this name is to understand the soul of the coast. It is an image born from the observation of constant, brutal impact. When the massive, heavy waves of the Pacific, fueled by the momentum of thousands of miles of open, uninterrupted ocean, collide with these unyielding stone walls, they do not simply break, they explode. They are pulverized into a white, ghostly shroud of mist that coats the dark, jagged cliffs in a perpetual veil. That foam is more than just sea spray. It is the signature of the storm, the only physical evidence left behind when the ocean's infinite fury meets the Earth's immovable resolve. To the Pacheetit, and to those of us who study its history today, the name represents the character of a place where the land and the abyss are locked in an eternal violent marriage, and where the offspring of that union is always tragedy. Yet, even before it bore the name Pachena, this finger of land carried a title that was perhaps even darker and more prophetic: Beggados Point. This name was a scar left by the year 1879, when the ship Beggadas Ambiadas was torn apart by these very reefs. For nearly 30 years, the point was forced to carry the name of the vessel it had destroyed, serving as a grim reminder to every passing mariner that the land itself is a monument to failure and death. This is a crucial realization for anyone who stands on these cliffs today. To name a location after a shipwreck is to acknowledge that the geography is defined by sacrifice. It proves that from the very moment this point was discovered by the modern world, its destiny was bound to the concept of the blood offering. The grim toll of this destiny was realized with agonizing clarity on the first day of 1896, while the rest of the civilized world was raised in a toast to the new year. A bark named the Janet Cowan, en route from South Africa to the burgeoning port of Vancouver, was engaged in a desperate fight for its very existence. It was 1:30 a.m. on New Year's Day, a time meant for celebration and rebirth, but for the 27 crewmen on board, it was the beginning of a cold, subarctic purgatory. A wild winter storm, fueled by the relentless freezing fury of the North Pacific, drove the ship directly into the jagged teeth of the rocks near Pachena Point. The ship was lost almost instantly, its hull groaning as the spine of the vessel snapped against the reef. There was no choice but to abandon her to the waves. But in these waters, abandoning a ship is a feat of terrifying acrobatics. The crew had to inch their way to the shore using nothing but rope lines and a bosun's chair, a precarious swinging wooden seat suspended over a lethal churning surf. One by one, the men crossed the black abyss, watching the white foam explode beneath them. Then came Captain Thompson. As the last man to leave his command following the ancient law of the sea, destiny seemed to turn its back on him in the most cruel fashion imaginable. As he made his way toward the cliff, the chair flipped. The line twisted. In a horrific display of the sea's mockery, the captain was dragged head down through the freezing surf, his body battered against the unyielding rocks and submerged in the icy, salt-choked water for the entire journey to the shore. He survived the crossing, but the ocean had already claimed his spirit. What followed was 11 days of sheer, unadulterated agony that tested the very limits of human endurance. Imagine 18 survivors huddling on a bleak, snow-covered bluff, overlooking the shattered wreckage of their hopes. They had no shelter against the biting wind. They had no warmth. They watched through the freezing mist for a passing ship that never came, their eyes burning from the salt and the cold. 9 of their crew had vanished into the impenetrable, dark forest in a desperate final search for help, leaving the rest to wait in a landscape that actively wanted them dead. Day after day, the cold seeped into their marrow. They sat around a pathetic, sputtering fire, their faces transformed into masks of utter helplessness. One by one, the life simply went out of them. 5 men, including the battered Captain Thompson, drew their last shuddering breaths on that cliffside, their bodies succumbing to hypothermia and exhaustion just days before rescue finally arrived. When the tugboat Tai eventually found them on January 11th, the rescuers were met with a sight that haunted their dreams for decades. 13 men, broken and hollowed out by the elements, staring with glassy eyes into the dying flames of a fire that could no longer warm the dead. But as tragic as the Janet Cowan was, the bureaucratic gears in Ottawa remained motionless. The government issued hollow talk of a lighthouse. They debated the cost of a life-saving trail, but they did nothing. They waited for a greater catastrophe to justify the expense. And because they waited, the graveyard of the Pacific claimed its greatest, most horrific prize 10 years later. January 22, 1906. The SS Valencia. This was the final straw, the massacre that would finally force the world to look at the blood-stained foam of Pachena Point. Captain Oscar Marcus Johnson was a seasoned, capable mariner, but he made a singular fatal mistake that haunts the annals of maritime history. He neglected to account for the powerful, silent, and invisible pull of the northern current. Thinking he was safely entering the mouth of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, he instead steered 160 innocent souls directly into the meat grinder of the Pachena reefs. The impact was cataclysmic. Almost immediately, the ship began to disintegrate under the rhythmic hammer blows of waves that rose as high as the mastheads. What followed was a scene ripped from the darkest pages of a nightmare. As the iron hull snapped, a pitiful chorus rose into the freezing night, the mingled screams of men, women, and children fighting to be heard over the shriek of the gale. In a desperate final attempt to stay above the drowning surge, the women and children were lashed to the rigging, high above the deck. Close your eyes and try to see what the few survivors saw. Frail women, wearing nothing but thin night dresses, their bare feet gripping the frozen ratlines as the wind tore at their hair. The wind was a razor, the rain was ice. They clung to the ropes with blue, numbed fingers, trying to shield their screaming, terrified children in their arms, praying for a miracle as the freezing spray coated them in a literal shroud of ice. They watched from the heights of the mast as their husbands and friends were swept away in bunches by massive black waves, disappearing into the maw of the sea in a heartbeat. There were 160 people on that ship. 133 of them died. But the most crushing statistic, the one that broke the heart of a nation and finally shattered the government's apathy, was this: not a single woman or child survived. Not one. They died in the rigging, frozen like statues. They died in the surf, their bodies broken against the stones. Or they died waiting for a rescue that was only a few hundred yards away on the shore, but unreachable due to the sheer impenetrable cliffs that offered no path to safety. The SS Valencia wasn't just a shipwreck, it was a slaughter of the innocent. It was the moment the silence of the Canadian government was finally shattered by the phantom screams of the drowned. Only after the loss of 133 lives did the Marine agent William P. Anderson write of the natural difficulties that defied description. Only after the blood of children stained the foam on the rocks did the construction of the Pachena Point Lighthouse begin in earnest. Every stone of that tower, every beam of its wooden frame is a direct response to the Valencia. Every rhythmic flash of its light is a tribute to those women in night dresses who froze to death in the rigging while staring at the shore. We must never forget that the light we see today was paid for in advance, not in gold or silver, but in the lives of those who had to die in the dark so that others could live in the light. Pachena Point stands today not just as a guide for ships, but as a monument to the high cost of silence and the enduring power of the foam on the rocks. The construction of the Pachena Point Lighthouse was never merely an achievement of timber, stone, and mortar. It was a desperate, visceral, and moral response to a stretch of coastline that had gorged itself on human life for far too long. For decades, the graveyard of the Pacific had operated with a cold, mechanical hunger, but it was the searing public grief following the SS Valencia tragedy that finally broke the silence of the Canadian government. The development of a comprehensive life-saving system began in earnest, but for those tasked with its creation, it was a mission that felt like waging an outright war against the very architecture of the natural world. This was not a standard construction site. It was a battlefield where the enemy was the Earth itself. Marine Agent William P. Anderson, a man typically confined to the dry prose of government bureaucracy, found himself moved to a state of awe and warning rarely seen in official proposals. He spoke of natural difficulties so immense, so primal, that they could barely be conceived by those who had not felt the freezing spray of the Pacific biting into their own skin. He described a rugged front of impenetrable mountains that rose like jagged teeth, dense brush that acted as a tangled living wall against human intrusion, and deep, jagged ravines that sliced through the coastline like ancient scars. These geological barriers made access from both land and sea almost entirely impossible. This was the brutal theater of operations where George H. Frost began his work in late 1907, a place where the very soil seemed to recoil at the invasive presence of man. Because there were no roads and the terrain refused to yield even an inch to the surveyor's transit, every single ounce of material, every hand-hewn wooden beam, every heavy bag of cement, and every precious drop of fresh water had to be ferried in by ship through the unpredictable and violent swells of the West Coast. But the geography offered no kindness. The ships could not dock against those sheer vertical walls of stone. To bridge this terrifying gap, engineers were forced to bypass the Earth entirely. They constructed an aerial tramway, a terrifying umbilical cord of steel cables suspended hundreds of feet over a churning, whitewater abyss. One must try to imagine the raw courage of the laborers during those months. They spent their days dangling in small wooden crates, suspended between heaven and hell, held only by a groaning wire as the Pacific winds tried to whip them into the rocks below. They were building a monument to safety while standing on the very precipice of death, knowing that a single frayed strand of steel was all that separated them from the graveyard below. But nature struck back with a fury that could not be bargained with or pacified. Prolonged storms, lasting for weeks on end, saturated the thin soil and eroded the very ground the workers stood upon. In February 1907, the breaking point was reached. A catastrophic landslide, triggered by the relentless rains, tore through the construction site with the sound of 1,000 cracking bones. In a matter of heart-stopping seconds, the entire tower, the product of months of back-breaking agony and human hope, was swept clean off the cliffside and swallowed by the dark, hungry belly of the sea. It was a moment that would have broken lesser men. Yet, the crew did not retreat to the safety of the mainland. In an act of pure, divine defiance, they climbed down to the water's edge, scavenged what they could from the salt-soaked wreckage, and they started over. They began again from the very first stone, rebuilding on the exact ground that had just betrayed them, proving that human resolve could be as unyielding as the granite of the point. The final result of this agony was a beautiful octagonal wooden tower, standing exactly 38 feet 9 inches from its base to the lantern floor. It was a sturdy, sloping structure designed to shed the rain and withstand the gales that had claimed so many ships. Beside it, a double dwelling and a rectangular fog alarm building were etched into the rock, standing together as a lonely fortress against the encroaching mist. On September 1st, 1907, the first headkeeper, John S. Richardson, climbed the ladder and lit a temporary beacon, a single lantern perched atop a gas tank. It was a small, flickering promise in a vast, predatory darkness. It signaled that the era of the blind trap was over, but it also heralded the beginning of a much darker internal struggle for those who lived within the tower's shadow. Richardson, a bachelor, arrived at this desolate outpost with his sister, who served as his assistant. They were the first to experience the radical, soul-crushing isolation of Pachena Point. It was a stone prison where the horizon never changed, and the rhythmic, mocking roar of the waves never ceased. The profound loneliness of the point, combined with the gray, suffocating fog that often lasted for days, began to eat away at the mind. It drove Richardson's sister into a deep and impenetrable depression. The silence of the cliffs became louder than any storm. In November 1908, she reached her breaking point and leaped from the jagged cliffs into the void, choosing the sea over the solitude. Richardson was left to man the light alone, forced to live with the haunting image of that fall etched into his mind every time he stepped out to check the weather or trim the wick. Grief-stricken and haunted by the phantom screams of his sister, he could no longer bear the shadows of Pachena. He left the station shortly after, though he continued his service at nearby Cape Beale, forever carrying the heavy, hollow silence of the point in his soul. While the lighthouse stood watch over the waves, a second lifeline was being carved through the ancient forest behind it. The life-saving trail began to take shape on June 21st, 1907, near Bamfield. 60 men, armed with nothing but handsaws and horse teams, engaged in the Herculean task of carving a path through the dark, tangled wilderness. This was a forest where the trees were hundreds of years old, and the undergrowth was a thicket of thorns and swamp. By November of that year, they had cleared 22 miles of trail, building 20 bridges over deep ravines and treacherous marshes. When it was finally completed to Carmana in 1912, at a staggering cost of over $175,000, it was a 12-foot wide artery of life stretching from Bamfield to Shelter Bight, the site of the Valencia massacre. Along this route, shelter huts were stocked with supplies, blankets, and maps, creating a sanctuary for those who'd been spat out by the sea. The system was tested almost immediately in January 1909, when the ship Soquel struck the Seabird Rocks, just west of the point. In years past, this would have been a death sentence. But this time, the Pachena keeper saw the distress fires lit by the crew on an offshore ledge and immediately telegraphed for help. Because of the new light and the new lines of communication, every soul on the Soquel was saved. Yet the victory was bittersweet and stained with blood. The captain's wife and small child were tragically crushed when the ship's mast collapsed during the rescue. It was a stark, brutal reminder that even with the best systems and the brightest lights, the sea always demands a price for its mercy. In 1909, the station finally received its crowning jewel, a first-order Fresnel lens, manufactured by the master craftsmen of the Chance brothers in England. This priceless masterpiece of glass and brass was a cathedral of light. It did not sit on wheels or traditional bearings. Such things would create friction that would dull its precision. Instead, the multi-ton apparatus floated. It was submerged in a circular vat of liquid mercury, allowing the massive, towering lens to rotate with such effortless grace that a single human finger could set the entire structure in motion. Every 7.44 seconds, it completed its circuit, sending out a powerful double flash beam that cut through the thickest, most suffocating fog like a divine sword of light. This lens remains preserved today, a silent glass heartbeat of the tower that has saved thousands from the rocks. Yet, life at Pachena Point was not solely defined by the tragedies of the past or the cold precision of technology. A small, resilient community began to grow as telegraph workers and radio operators joined the keepers. A wireless station was built in 1907, and a direction-finding antenna was added in 1923, turning the lonely point into a hub of communication. This tiny society, huddled together against the elements, found joy in the very shadow of the tower. They used the base of the lighthouse as a schoolroom for their children during the week, teaching them of a world beyond the cliffs. And on Saturday nights, the transformation was complete. They would clear the desks, bring out a fiddle, and transform the cold stone floor into a ballroom. Can you see them? They danced on the edge of the world, with the storms of the Pacific howling outside and the ghosts of the shipwrecks beneath the waves. They laughed and spun in circles because they knew that in a place so defined by death and isolation, the only way to survive was to celebrate life together. They were the living light of Pachena, a testament to the fact that while the ocean may be vast and cruel, the human spirit is a flame that no storm can truly extinguish. Every flash of the Pachena light today carries the echo of those dances, a rhythmic reminder that we serve the light so that the darkness never wins. The history of Pachena Point has always been a mirror of the world's chaos. But as the 1940s arrived, the lighthouse was forced to step out of its role as a universal savior and into the shadows of global conflict. World War II changed the very soul of the point. In 1942, after the nearby Estevan Point Lighthouse was shelled by a Japanese submarine, the first time Canadian soil had been attacked by a foreign power since the 19th century. The fear on the coast became a physical weight. The order was given: Pachena Point must vanish. The beautiful white octagonal tower, which had stood as a beacon of hope for decades, was stripped of its identity. It was painted a drab, muted green-gray to blend into the ancient forest and the misty cliffs, a ghost of its former self. But the camouflage was more than just paint. The light itself, the very heartbeat of the reef, was extinguished to prevent enemy navigators from using it as a landmark. For the first time since 1907, the graveyard of the Pacific was truly intentionally dark. But as history has proven time and again at Pachena, when the light dies, tragedy is the inevitable consequence. In 1943, the SS Uzbekistan, a Soviet merchant vessel carrying vital supplies, was navigating these treacherous waters. Without the 7.44-second double flash to warn them of the foam on the rocks, the crew was blind. Driven by currents they could not see, and a shore they could not find, the Uzbekistan slammed into the jagged reefs. By a miracle of fate, every soul on board was rescued, but the broken hull of the ship remained as a grim, rusted testament to a simple truth: without the light, the ocean always wins. The wreckage of the Uzbekistan proved that even in a time of war, the greatest enemy on this coast was not a submarine. It was the darkness itself. As the decades rolled by, the world moved into the digital age. Satellites and GPS began to replace the visceral need for a man in a tower with a wick and a lens. But Pachena Point remained one of the few places where a human heartbeat still kept watch over the abyss. However, the very earth that the keepers had fought so hard to tame began to betray them once again. The ground beneath the historic buildings, saturated by a century of storms and shifting with the tectonic whispers of the coast, was no longer stable. The cliffs were crumbling. The foundations were failing. The Canadian Coast Guard was forced to make a heartbreaking decision. To protect the lives of those who protect the sea, the station would be destaffed. The era of the resident lighthouse keeper, a lineage of resilience that had survived landslides, suicides, and world wars, was coming to an end. The final chapter of this 117-year odyssey was written on October 24th, 2024. Imagine the weight of that morning. Lance McNichol, the last in a long, proud line of Pachena keepers, climbed the steps one final time. He looked out over the same churning surf that had claimed the Valencia and the Janet Cowan. He felt the same wind that had driven John Richardson's sister to the edge. With a steady hand and a heavy heart, he keyed his radio and transmitted the final weather report from Pachena Point. When the transmission ended, a silence fell over the cliffs that hadn't been felt since 1907. As Lance walked away from the light, he wasn't just leaving a job. He was closing a door on a century of human defiance. The light may still flash, automated and cold, but the soul of the station, the human eye that watched the horizon for a ship in distress, the human hand that clears the soot from the glass, is gone. 117 years of history ended not with a storm, but with a final broadcast and a quiet footstep on a gravel path. We are left now with the foam on the rocks, the ghosts in the mist, and the memory of those who stood in the dark so that we might find our way home. My dear friends, lighthouses have always fascinated me because they represent the best of us, the refusal to let the storm win. If you have a story of a lighthouse that moved you, or a moment where a distant light guided you through your own personal storm, please share it with us in the comments below. Your stories keep these lanterns burning. Thank you for walking this rugged coastline with me today. If this journey moved you, please like, share, and follow so you don't miss our next deep dive into the mysteries of the past. It truly helps us keep these histories alive. Until we meet again in our next video, take care and keep watching the horizon.